Welcome, everybody, to this week's Rise and Tide Foundation lecture, where I am super happy to have Anton Chaitkin. Anton Chaitkin, once again, he's blown people's minds in many past presentations. I'm going to put a link to a few of them, as well as a link to his book, Anton's recent book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress, Volume 1, which ends at around the time that a very important chapter of world history, not just American history, is taking place in the form of the foreign-directed civil war in the United States. Not an simply American phenomenon. It is part of a broader global chemistry, as Anton elegantly goes through. And currently, he is working through Volume 2, which should be online in the coming months ahead. And we are going to be privy to some of the discoveries that he's been able to make along the way and has been generous enough to share with us, specifically focusing on a very important battle over potentials that were actualized and some that were subverted in the wake of Lincoln's victory in maintaining the Union, and the international dynamics of the late 19th century, specifically Reconstruction. Recently, Magdalena introduced Reconstruction to many people who might have not been too familiar with some of the dynamics, and she scratched on the surface of a lot of things. She went into domains that I didn't even know about, and I knew that this is going to be a really wonderful sister piece to that. So today, Anton, thank you. I'm going to just leave the baton to you, and I'll let you blow people's minds as you always do.
Oh, good. We have enough people here to start?
I think we're okay.
Okay. Hello. It's great to be back in this company of distinguished people. There's Bruce de Torres. Look at that. Wow. Holy cow. All right. So I'm going to start off by boasting. I'm going to give my credentials. I'm 80 years old. Just had my 80th birthday this year. And I've had virtually a lifetime of thinking about the principles of justice. And then within that, about a half century of research on the realm
of the phone number for the meeting. You could use that.
On the realm of history that I'm talking about. Somebody's not muted.
I fixed that.
Okay, good. And then the study and research was in collaboration with the world's best minds on this strategy of civilization versus oligarchism, the strategy for civilization. People assembled around Lyndon LaRouche, and through them we were put in touch with, I would say, people of goodwill and genius throughout every continent. And we had decades of experience with firsthand conflict with agencies of these enemies of civilization. So with that said, I would start with a warning, and we keep this in the back of your mind, and it brings up a very difficult problem. I would say we should feel shame and revulsion when we see people heatedly disputing about today's political issues without basing the discussion and the fight on the relevant principles from the deeper history of our country and the world. And this is a very hard problem, but it must be taken on. We all face this among our contacts and friends and in other ways. We're tempted to get into things that are not worth our demeaning ourselves in a certain way. We can always bring principles to fights, but you have to have that in mind. So anyway, the topic today that I have is the subject is what I have in what I'm writing for now, chapter 8 of volume 2, and it's on the reconstruction of the American South after the Civil War. I imagine that everybody here with this kind of company is familiar with that subject in one way or another. Is that correct? You say, everybody? Yeah. Okay. And what, so often presented as radicals, moderates, and conservatives in a very almost useless fashion. I'm presenting it in a new light, and that is the fight of nation builders, people building the country up, the industries, who are the militants fighting for the rights of the freed slaves and to end the plantation system in the South, not to have people get rights within that old system. You can't have plantations. You can't have a colonial relationship between that section and the rest of the country and the world, or you're doomed. And that section will be a constant source of danger to the country and even to the world. So the idea was to replace that plantation system with diversified modern industries and family farms, and to solve the problem. So in order to understand what was going on in this, the period I'm talking about is 1865 to 1877, most of which took place 1865 to 73, when there was an induced depression, induced directly as a political attack that ended, for all intents and purposes, Reconstruction at that point, by crushing these industrial and nationalists, this side. So I'm going to go through just a few points about that you have to know about to see what was being fought over. So start with Lincoln's identity. This is something I went through in the first 3 chapters. It's easily identified from his writings and his speeches and from so many biographies, but the public is ignorant of his identity. He is involved with Henry Clay in a long political war, decades-long war. And he himself is the leading builder of the state of Illinois, canals, railroads, and industries, and cities, Chicago in particular. And he has a very well-defined and sophisticated economic rationale of labor rights and protectionism versus the money power and the usurers. The main thing going on in the latter decades of Lincoln, especially in the 1850s, it really started in the 1840s, was the Southern Empire. Remember that the cotton economy was part of the British Empire. They exported the cotton and imported manufactured goods from England. But beyond that, the slavery was doomed because it was destroying the soil and eating up the labor force. So they had to spread it, but they had this ideology that went with that they were against the Republic. And so the idea was to have a Southern Empire that would be in the world alongside the British and French empires, with a real hatred for republicanism. And they wanted to crush the United States. So that's what Lincoln was up against. His strategy against that, to deal with that, was on another level altogether. And you have to see these are not congruent strategies. But Lincoln was completely right in the way he approached it. he wanted to stress the high destiny of mankind. And that's the framework within which his thoughts were. The history of progress, going back to the creation of man, the Renaissance, the issues of speaking, the distinction of man from the animals, speech, writing, printing, and a direct attack on Americans promoting imperialism. So against Mexico, and of course he saw against the war with Mexico. Now he's not against Mexico, he's defending Mexico. And at the time of the slave owner presidents, they sent an ambassador to China to try to get the same strangulation of China that the British had, a disgraceful treaty in the 1840s. So he saw these things. And he said that wars come from the want of sympathy between the peoples of mankind. And that's the basic problem that we face. Then there you have agricultural reform. I deal with this at length, but the fundamental issue then was the destruction, the environmental destruction from the imperial form of agriculture, where you're exporting your crop, and as Carey put it, you're exporting your soil. And so you're robbing nature and man, and Malthus is based on this. Yeah, the Malthusianism is true if you agree to have a constant robbery of man and nature, and don't enrich nature. You have to enrich the soil, and the value of the soil, the value of land, depends entirely on the labor and technology and capital that you put into it. And then you have the agrarian paradox, which everybody should sort of enjoy. Jefferson is the great agrarian and stood up for rural America, and yet he opposed the development of agro-industrial expertise and advancement that would allow farmers to flourish. A rural area, strictly rural, as opposed to scientific farming, a rural area, there's only two kinds of people that can have a life there. And one of them is a hermit or a hunter, a remote hunter. And the other is landed aristocrats. Everyone else is misery. So, these are Lincoln's principles. I show in the early parts of the book that Henry Carey, the writer economist, was the leading strategist for the Republican Party on the American side, on the nationalist side, and that Carey and Lincoln were the two chief strategists whose ideas went into the Lincoln administration. And there's a lot of intertwining between the two, including how Lincoln got nominated for president. I have a chapter on the Philadelphia industrialists, primarily the Pennsylvania Railroad leaders, and the role they played in the Civil War, where Tom Scott, who was the vice president, Pennsylvania Railroad, and J. Edgar Thompson, the president of it, and another railroad guy who's allied to them, Felton, they organized the logistics for the Union armies at the beginning of the war. And Tom Scott was Assistant Secretary of War. Particularly, they had to get around the covert enemy operations within Maryland, which was not in the was not in the Confederacy, and the staged mobs put up by these guys, typical, British radicalism and insanity and fascism. So they had to get the troops around this, and they devised very, very intelligent ways to do that in cooperation with the military. And they ran intelligence. Tom Scott, in particular, was a master of U.S. intelligence during that time, along with a few other people. So that's the background of this, the post-war. In the post-war period, beginning immediately after the murder of Lincoln, you're in a situation in which there's some incredibly good things going on done by these people, and terrible things done by the president, the new president who took over, Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee. And he is sustained by a group of New England, particularly New England Anglophiles, and I'll get into exactly who was really running that. But they're trying to sabotage any kind of protection of Black people and any real change in the South, except ending official slavery. So on our side in Reconstruction, the militants, first of all, what were they doing besides were you raising your hand for a question? No. Okay, never mind. On our side, first of all, the Pennsylvania Railroad itself and its leaders organized the American steel industry from scratch. And they got a few other really strong patriots who were anti-imperial to do it with them. Nobody who built the first steel mills was not of this character. This is an incredibly important, feature of the what you have to find in history now about this whole thing. There's certain components of the economy that define the rise, delineate the rise to power. And it was this group that organized all of that. The three that, two of them I go through right now, steel and petroleum. The third is electricity. They're all inventions of this era. And all of them come from this grouping that organized them. And then steel and petroleum started right after the Civil War. While they're doing this, they had a warning from the British, from the U.S. consul in England, in Liverpool, that the British are not only, this was the warning that he gave. Well, he was working during the war to stop them building, warships for the Confederacy in England. But after the war, he sent a warning that they are organizing a new intervention into the United States, into our politics, and they're setting up organizations in our country to promote free trade and other British objectives. And this warning was read on the floor of the House by one of these steelmakers allied to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The fight around the rights of the Black people and around trying to keep the old Confederates from running the South after they'd been defeated, just coming back and taking over again. At the same time, there's a fight over the economic policy of the country, about the retirement of the currency that this Anglophile faction tried to do to squeeze industry and the population, and around the whole economic policy. This faction in New England wanted cheap cotton, just like the British did. They were textile manufacturers. Well, doesn't that make them, if they're manufacturers, doesn't that make them pro-manufacturing? No. If I'm human, that by definition would seems to me would make me favor other humans, right? This doesn't necessarily happen that way. Some human beings don't like other humans. And so the financiers, the capitalists in Boston, particularly the ones I'll mention, were controlling the textile industry, and they didn't want competition in the South with Southern factories to make cloth and clothing, or in the West. Let them be the only ones. If you have cheap cotton and no competition, then they can make more profits. And but it's also part of the British strategy, which they are part of, and they joined the British clubs, the Cobden Club and other ones, to keep the USA in general from developing manufacturing. Now, keep in mind another thing. The 1619 Project of the New York Times attacks the United States for having slavery from the time of 1619, and says that slavery made, oh, my picture just went out. Slavery made the United States rich. And this lie is based on saying that slave cotton went to Boston manufacturers, cotton mills. Well, that's true. It also, the Southern slave owners got rich also, and some New York brokers, and a lot of people in London. But industry is not just low-level manufacturing. In particular, your industrial advancement is based on those kinds of commodities and processes that propel the economy forward. So when you advance into steel making, when you develop petroleum as a more constant, and coal as concentrated fuels, and electricity, all these things, and when you perfect the railroad, that's the advancements and the real wealth of a modern country. So that's all coming from and sponsored by people with a political intention to advance man's powers. All right, so they're doing all these things while they're trying to fight for a good outcome in the South. So the leader of the nationalists in the U.S. Congress was Thaddeus Stevens. He's a congressman representing Lancaster, Pennsylvania, originally from Gettysburg. And he is a strong supporter of Henry Carey's point of view. He's closely connected to the Pennsylvania Railroad. He himself is an iron manufacturer. And he is a ferocious baiter of the bear, in a certain sense, of these Southern guys and of the Northern sponsors of them. I'll start with his proposal, which went through Congress in 1867, for setting up for organizing a military government over the South. And his bill went through different versions. It comes out, they passed it. So you had several zones that were to be controlled by the U.S. Army under the U.S. commanders in the South. Texas and Louisiana is one zone, and so forth. And at the same time, Stevens, all who know who Thaddeus Stevens is, everybody, he's portrayed as the vicious, vengeance-filled madman who helps blacks to take over when they're not qualified in the movies, in the early U.S. movies, and in most history books until recently. So he also proposed confiscation of the land of the richest plantation owners, exempting the smaller planters. So he's taking on the leadership of the Confederacy in that way, and also that this land has to be distributed to the freed black slaves so that they're not at the economic mercy of the establishment in the South. And of course, what was happening at that time is they were passing laws. You may know that the 13th Amendment to our Constitution that Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens put through in 1865 had a flaw in it. And that was that slavery and involuntary servitude was outlawed except in punishment for a crime. That's still the way it's written. So we still have this problem. So what they did in the South is, after the war, Lincoln's good and dead, is they just passed laws that anybody who's black and has a bad attitude or is not working for the people the police thought they should be, is arrested for vagrancy and rented out as a convict. And his children can be made wards of the plantation owner. So the Stevens law for military governance and for confiscation of the estates inspired the black people of the South and the North into organization, self-organization. There were a lot of strikes in the South. Blacks got into politics right away, and they expected to get land, and they were on the move. At this point, another gentleman from Philadelphia named William D. Kelly went on a tour of the South. He's a famous militant abolitionist from Philadelphia. He's also famous. He's called Pig Iron Kelly by his enemies because he's so much for tariffs. And he's known everywhere as a militant, and yet he spoke to racially integrated audiences in the South, all around the South, because what he was proposing was changing the system in the South for the benefit of everybody. And he said the former system is completely stupid. You had all these resources which you didn't use, iron and coal and everything else. You could support 500 million people in the Mississippi Valley to go to manufacturing and modern agriculture. And so the argument was raised against him that we only have degraded labor in the South. Our labor is so stupid and backward from all these years and years of the slave system. And he said, well, I just went to a school for black children, and I quizzed a 6-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl on arithmetic and writing and geography. And there's your genius in the future. You want to have an intelligent labor force? Give up your persecution of poor people and black people. Give up your prejudice. I know about those prejudices. I used to be prejudiced in the same way. Because if you want to be redeemed, you have to have huge industrial progress right now. And he had tremendous reception all over the South. Then Henry Carey wrote, look, you want to solve this problem? Go to the central zone of the South, the mountainous zone, alongside the Appalachian Mountains, where the minerals are and where the farmers are who don't care for slavery and they want to be independent. That's always been the case. But they were often forced to not do independent things because of the political power of the slave owners under the imperial system. So if you want to break up the imperial system and the plantation system, go into that zone with railroads, actively promote manufacturing, diversified manufacturing, get these minerals into operation for the use of the people there. And that area, that zone will have hegemony over the whole South. You've solved the problem, or you're on your way to solving it. He also said you need to redistribute the land, and he pointed to what the Tsar of Russia did when he freed the serfs, and what Baron von Stein did in Prussia earlier in his writings right then. So that's caring. And he pointed to Lincoln's proposal to do just what he said, to build railroads into that zone and take advantage of the sympathies in that area. So immediately after, they tried to impeach the president, Johnson. Now, working with Johnson I identified a quartet of people. If you want to write their names down, you might have fun looking this up, because this is sort of the history behind the history. 2 Treasury secretaries in succession. The first was named William Pitt Fessenden, named after the British Prime Minister. And the other one was Hugh, H-U-G-H, McCulloch, M-C-C-U-L-L-O-C-H. Both of them appointed by Lincoln after he appointed a similar one before them, Salmon Chase. And he was taking people that were pro-free trade and were agreeable to the financiers, so that he could just not have annoyance from the financiers on that score, but he would be running the policy. Well, unfortunately, when he chose McCulloch, he was immediately murdered, and this terrible vice president took over, and McCulloch stayed there. So here you have this guy, Hugh McCulloch. Fessenden became a U.S. senator. There was a cotton manufacturer, textile guy named Edward Atkinson, one of the leaders of the free trade organizations. And then the granddaddy of all these guys is a Boston financier named John M. Forbes, F-O-R-B-E-S. I've written about him in the Treason book, and I go through his identity again and updated it in this book. He made his fortune in China as the personal secretary and manager, in many ways, a foreign relations manager for the Chinese head of security for the East India Company, named Hukwa. And then he took money from that guy, along with his own fortune, and invested it in Boston to set up an immense and prestigious investment banking firm there. Forbes is part of an incestuous group of families in Boston, the Boston Brahmins, all of whom at the top made their money from opium and slave trafficking and hostility to the United States founding. So this is the background of the people that stopped Reconstruction, that tried to battle Carey and the Pennsylvania people and say that, the blacks need to be you need to leave them in the care of the white people now that slavery is illegal. They just leave the problem alone. So these people stood up and stopped the impeachment of Johnson. Fessenden, the senator, former Treasury Secretary, was the key vote to acquit. It only takes a minority to stop a removal of a president in the Senate. So then what happened? The Pennsylvania Railroad, starting right after this, when General Grant was elected president to replace this no-good-nick Johnson, Pennsylvania Railroad embarked on a daring venture. They built, in a period of 2 to 3 years, a huge network of railroads in the South. They worked with Southerners. This was led by Tom Scott, the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I have a map of this. Can I share the screen? If I click on share screen and then go get that, will it show up good?
Sure. Yeah,
All right,
absolutely.
let me try that. I'll show you this map here. Hold on. Here it is. Can you see this?
No.
No,
Did you click share screen, the green button?
I thought I did. Wait a minute. Hold on. Where am I now?
Or you could email. You could always email it to me if you want, and I could share it.
Well,
Usually a window pops up, and then you have to select which window do you want to
oh
share.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, let me do that. It's fun. It'll be easier.
Okay.
Where is this now? All right, here it is. Okay. Share screen. How do I do this? Damn Zoom thing.
Yeah.
I got to
Usually
get back into the Zoom again to do this.
We'll do a little crash course after this class. I'll give you an
Sorry,
update.
hold on.
That's
All I have is the big, huge word Zoom on my screen.
Oh yeah.
Maybe I should go back. Wait, I got it. Here it is. Launch meeting. I know how to do it. Okay.
Hmm.
All right, there I am. Share. Oh, and it says which screen? Screen one. This
Yeah.
screen, right?
So whichever screen you have. Yeah,
That's
there you
it.
go. This is.
Okay. Now you see my screen.
I see your screen.
Okay. Now I'm going to do this map.
Okay.
And here's the map. Now, do you see this map?
Yes.
All
Railroad.
right. If people can just focus on this for a second. This is the southern network built by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 2 or 3 years. Keep in mind, the Pennsylvania Railroad is the dominant northern railroad. They have lines from New York through Philadelphia to Chicago and St. Louis. It's the biggest corporation in the country. It made the railroad excellent in America. They put steel on the rail. They made steel rails, and they put in the air brake. So these are the people that are not only bringing steel and using the railroads and their shipping and pipelines to transport petroleum to start that up, but they are their objective is to build up the whole country, and they have to crack the South to do that. So here they went through Baltimore and Washington. They built a tunnel under Baltimore. They fought it out with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to do that. They got allies in the South and in Baltimore to help them do that. They established the great Pennsylvania Terminal in Washington, which became Union Station. Long later, it was the Pennsylvania Station in New York City. So then they used a Southern Railroad, a Virginia Railroad, as a kind of a mother thing to take over, extend, rebuild the ruined ones, and connect all these old railroads in the South and new ones along the coast, all the way down to the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Alabama. And crucially, now look at this here, from Virginia down through Tennessee. And that follows the Tennessee Valley into and across to Memphis, on the Mississippi River. To do this, they set up a holding company called the Southern Railroad Security Company, Southern Railroad Security Company. The president of that company, in its last year, it was only around for a couple of years. The president of that company was a man from Hyde Park, New York, named James Roosevelt. He was a Democrat, so he wasn't in with this Republican group, but he was very loyal to the Union. He was the secretary of the Loyal League of New York. And they're opening up what was called the Scott Route through the Tennessee Valley from the north and right through this mineral region in northern Alabama and in Tennessee. 60 years later, that Roosevelt's son, Franklin D. Roosevelt, would try to do the same thing that this Pennsylvania Railroad was trying to do, which is to open up the South and change it with the Tennessee Valley Authority. In the meantime, this group sponsored Thomas Edison to develop electricity, to give more power to that kind of an effort. Just keep that in mind. So this is all in 70, 71, 72 into 73, when the whole thing came under terrible attack. Now I want to focus on some remarkable new discovery that I just made yesterday about what happened when they started this, when the Pennsylvania Railroad itself, sort of the granddad of these nationalists, began this southern adventure. I'm going to go back to the regular screen now. So how do I do this? Let's see. Launch meeting. I don't want to.
No, don't watch the meeting. Just hit when you move your mouse to the upper part of your screen, you should see end screen share.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I see a new share. You are screen sharing. Where does it say end?
So put your mouse, float your mouse to the upper middle part of the screen, and you'll see like a red button.
Oh, I see. Stop share.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's it. Okay, I got it. There I am. All right. So now just this is the last fun part. It's a mystery. This is a great mystery because it's based on things that are yet to be discovered, but I'm going to lead you into it. The first transcontinental railroad that Lincoln started was completed in 1869. The chief engineer for that railroad, General Grenville Dodge, was a great leader of military intelligence during the war, especially close to General Grant and later General Sherman, who employed him both for military intelligence versus the South and for railroad building. After the war, he became chief engineer for the Union Pacific Railroad. Now, a crucial thing is that during the war out in Missouri, General Dodge, when Black people would be leaving the plantations and escaping into his lines, he pioneered in this. He would arm those Blacks and set them up into units to fight. Not something that the white establishment in the South was particularly fond of. And he was a realist. He hadn't been an abolitionist before the war. He wasn't interested in that. He was a railroad surveyor. He was the one who showed Lincoln the route before the war, the route to the West. He was Lincoln's chief railroad advisor. So during the building of the Union Pacific, this guy, General Dodge, was always fighting with the financiers of the railroad. It was a terrible law that set up the railroad. It was very complicated, and we couldn't do much better because government didn't have any money, wasn't prepared for this big rebellion. But Lincoln wanted to do the railroad anyway, like building the dome. He wanted to do that for the Capitol. So General Dodge had a heroic success with I would say, heroic workers who built that line. Chinese in the West and in the Union Pacific eastern part of it, it was Irishmen and others. So he was always quarreling with these financiers, and he was backed up by the U.S. Army, by Sherman and Grant personally, who helped him run this thing and put him in command of building the railroad. At the end of building it in 1869, he came into a sort of a showdown with Thomas Durant, the chief financier, and other people involved in these scandals around the railroad, the Crédit Mobilier Company and some other scandals around the Union Pacific. And he said, okay, I'm through with you people. And he teamed up with Tom Scott and the Pennsylvania Railroad. He went over to this faction, the Carey faction, and he went to work as a partner of Tom Scott in building the Southern Transcontinental Railroad, called the Texas Pacific. The idea was to build from Texas, which was the end of the already established network by the by the Pennsylvania Railroad, from Texas out to San Diego. And they enlisted in this effort all the old Southern leaders, or not the worst crazies, but anybody who wanted to see the South rise again without on a new basis. Okay, we're not going to do plantations. We'll do industry. Some of them may have been for plantations, but they all agreed we've got to have a modern existence here. Jefferson Davis came to one of these things that was put on by Tom Scott, and many other people that weren't like Jefferson Davis. They were sort of middle ground during the war, but this was very much favored by the South. So at the point that Grenville Dodge was winding it up with the first Transcontinental Railroad, and really, before they even finished that, the ambassador of China to the United States, a man named Anson Burlingame, came to the USA. Now, how did somebody with a name like that become China's ambassador? Well, Lincoln appointed him U.S. ambassador to China to try to reverse the disgraceful imperialistic treaty we got with them when slave owners were running our country in the 1840s on top of the British Opium War. Lincoln and Burlingame, who's a ferocious anti-slavery guy and a man for justice, went over there to establish relations on a basis of justice and equality, or as some people might say today, win-win. And the Chinese liked him so much that they made him their ambassador to the United States and sent him back here as their ambassador, Anson Burlingame. So he came back in 67 at the height of this, I think late 67, maybe early 68, the height of this fighting over Reconstruction. And they were just about trying to impeach and throw out Johnson. So what's he going to do in this environment? He mainly worked with Grant, apparently, who was general of the army, and then was going to become president. So to get to the bottom of the story, according to the recollections of General Dodge, written in 1914, so 45 years after the events. So his memory is hazy, but there's no mistaking the quality of this recollection. He said that the Chinese wanted an American expert to go to China and build railroads there. And Ambassador Burlingame asked Grant, I don't know whether he was, general or already president. Probably he was already president. Asked Grant to recommend an expert, and he chose General Dodge, especially because of his qualifications as the most trusted person with regard to intelligence, the strategy of nation building, and the racial question. Right? You have that exact same racial question with American blacks as you do with Chinese people in here or in China. And at the time of Reconstruction, the issue of Chinese immigrants and the whole China question broke down on the same lines as the Reconstruction. The Southern fanatics and their Boston sponsors were anti-Chinese, going back a long time, and they liked the old treaty. They hated this stuff. So anyway, General Dodge accepted this commission, this job offer, this huge project, and closed up his affairs. And this is around 1869. He's about to go, this is just before he actually went into the Texas Pacific thing. And he was going to go to China. But Anson Burlingame, the Chinese ambassador, was then sent to Europe to make more treaties. And he died in Russia, 1869. And the China Railroad project died with him, according to General Dodge. In the 1880s, it was revived. The Chinese asked him again if he would do it. And he said, I can't, I'm too far gone, or whatever it is. I know, and many of you may know, that one of the followers of Henry Carey, Wharton Barker, in the late 1880s, actually worked with the Chinese government to develop a whole plan for building railroads throughout China. And that was squelched by the British. Sun Yat-sen later promoted virtually the same thing. So what was going on with General Dodge and with Tom Scott and with Henry Carey? The American ambassador to Russia at the time that Anson Burlingame went there for China from America, the American ambassador chosen by Grant at that time was Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, who was given a send-off by his great political leader, Henry Carey. Henry Carey more or less controlled all the ambassadors to Russia in that period. So what was going on with Burlingame and with the Chinese government? They had a self-strengthening movement in China to build railroads. And they didn't want America bossing them around about railroads. This had to be a Chinese construction, Chinese plan. Later on, there were foreign financiers that got into building some railroads in China, not for the benefit of the Chinese. It was just like what the British did in Africa or India. But this entire period of immense American progress and tragedy is the Reconstruction story in America, the real Reconstruction story. So what happened, just to end this, is that in 1873, the nationalists came under terrible attack by the new firm of Drexel Morgan. It was directed by J.P. Morgan's father in London, Junius Morgan. They attacked the credit of another project of the Pennsylvania Railroad called the Northern Pacific Railroad. They said these guys are going to go bankrupt. Jay Cook was the banker. He's going to go bankrupt. Take your money out of his bank. And when his bank collapsed, because the Congress had been scared away from supporting it, like they had supported earlier railroads, who scared them? The Adams family scared them. The Adams family changed sides to traitors from their predecessor, John Quincy Adams. His son led the way, Charles Francis Adams, and then that guy's son, Henry Adams, skunks and snakes that went completely over to the British enemy and opposed U.S. development, opposed rights for the blacks in the South, and tried to destroy the railroads of the country. So there was a crash when this bank failed. There was a world depression, the Panic of 1873. And the Pennsylvania Railroad had to retreat quickly from the south, pull their horns in. They came under subsequent attack from Vanderbilt and Rockefeller through the oil industry. And they were destroyed financially. Right after when this depression started, they made a huge effort to do something revolutionary in the North, which is they sponsored their protege, Andrew Carnegie, to build a completely new steelmaking operation. And they named it for the president. Carnegie named it for the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the J. Edgar Thompson Steel Mill, which revolutionized steelmaking in the world. And then about 8 years later, these guys, other people in this Philadelphia grouping, sponsored Edison and kept working with him despite the bullying by J.P. Morgan, till Edison personally set up the first power plants in the world, public power plants, and then got foreign partners, especially in Germany, to spread electricity in the world. That is the actual history of Reconstruction in the United States. That's the outline of it.
Thank you, Anton. And yeah, for anybody who is engaged in any level of research and truth seeking, you have definitely provided a lot of leads, a lot of juicy leads to go on
Maybe
here.
too much to absorb, but you can, ruminate on some of this and ask some questions and maybe play devil's advocate if you can.
Well, let's get the ball rolling on the Q&A and see what questions pop. I know Monty got in early. Monty, go for it.
Yes, Anton, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to interact with you throughout all these years. You spurred some thoughts of mine. In particular, I was reading the Anglo-Venetian Roots of the Deep State just this morning, again, reviewing chapter 23 and reference. You had some input of Thomas Huxley's X Club in 1864, which basically identified what they had to usurp in the realm of science and philosophy and culture and history in order to take control of the political economy and to defeat the tenets of what was known as the American system of political economy. In that light, and this might well be the subject of a future consideration, but I think maybe perhaps you can comment on it. Sergei Glaziev wrote a tribute to LaRouche. And in my mind, it appears to me that LaRouche, back in the 80s and 90s, through his collaboration with various people in Russia and China and his trips there, really set the stage and I think implanted the whole idea of what we're witnessing with the BRICS and the SCO and the Eurasian Economic Union today. I mean, the basic tenets of what they're putting forth as a requirement for a renaissance, for redevelopment and economic development.
Yeah.
Now, in that light, I'm seeing that there's, Russia obviously and Putin see this as an existential crisis. In other words, they had no choice but to go for a military victory in Ukraine and a defeat of Nazism in Ukraine. That was basically his bottom line. And in light of that, I wonder if you could comment on this, because there's a lot of calls in various sectors, for the Vatican to intervene for a ceasefire, to stop hostilities. And in light of that, if you could comment, I think the same thing occurred with Lincoln. To reach, to stop the hostilities, to reach some accord with the British, which would have ultimately been a defeat for America and the American system. In other words, he also saw the demilitarization and the victory in the South and what you might describe as the denazification in the South, which wasn't Nazi at the time, but you get my drift of who was behind that. In other
Yeah.
words, it is an existential crisis.
I understand. I understand what you're asking. Yeah.
The ceasefire or the militarized no-fly zone is not going to work. In
Okay.
other words, it's
So
anti.
Monty?
Go ahead.
yeah,
All right, I think Anton's got a thought.
Let me put. I have a few thoughts in response. First of all, Lincoln was anti-war. You have to remember that. Keep that in mind. He didn't want to have a war to free the slaves. He wanted to free the slaves by the same way that Alexander Hamilton did, which is to develop the whole country, including the South. And early on, his economic advisor, long before the Lincoln presidency, Carey, identified this zone of the South and the right strategy for doing this, for undermining the plantation system and outflanking it. During the war, Lincoln had a Reconstruction policy, which was criticized by militants, including these nationalists like Thaddeus Stevens and Benjamin Wade, for being too lenient on the South during the war. And but Lincoln's primary concern was to get these people to stop the fighting the United States. During the war, he wanted to have some way of collapsing the Confederacy as a separate nation, as a separate entity, and having the army disassemble. That was his primary concern, and that was totally legitimate. And he posed the Emancipation Proclamation in those terms. He also wanted to end the system that was involved with slavery, the plantation system, and modernize our country and the world. That's his deeper principle. So people criticize as too lenient to the South. You're not going to solve the problem if you let them quit the war and then just let them come back in the Union. Well, he didn't just want to let them come back in the Union. He wanted to change the South. But his responsibility as president was to end the war, because the war wasn't two countries fighting. It was an attempt with British sponsorship to destroy the United States. And if they quit and stopped it, that's a magnificent victory. And so I would say, first of all, and let me continue, but I would say that any serious negotiations to end the war would be very good. The policy, remember that it's not just encirclement of Russia. This is endless war, right? The policy of the oligarchs since God knows when, really, the empires, is constant warfare and constant disruption of civilization. That has to be terminated. And you have to go over to a completely different approach, which is what we used to call civilization as an active principle. All right, those are the two competing things, the war and civilization. So the fact that Russia carried out this military operation in Ukraine doesn't define Russia's policy. That's a tactic. It was maybe necessary, but it's a tactic in the face of these insane people on the other side, these anti-civilization people. Mm-hmm. The same thing applies to China and Russia, as I said about everybody else. If to the extent that somebody may be representing China, probably not Putin, but somebody else, talks about issues in the war without reference to the history that I went through, they're wrong. They're just dead wrong. This is a serious problem. Now, I want to bring up, I talked to Matt before we went on about this, just really quickly. And it's really on the same subject. The United States attacks and threatens to attack China based on their authoritarianism. That is, their government is a form of a dictatorship, and they don't respect the people's rights to oppose them. This is obviously not only China is in that position with respect to the United States, but also some of the countries in the Americas, in Africa, in the Middle East, and so forth. All right, Nicaragua, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, several African countries, and so forth. I think Biden's even talking about making Uganda an authoritarian enemy because they outlawed aggressive homosexual aggression, meaning killing someone with AIDS. They made that a criminal thing. So we should put sanctions on them too. Leave that aside. I definitely do not want to get into, gay rights and anything like that, because that's a complete terrible mistake to get into that. But what about authoritarianism versus the West? What's the purpose of the West in the world? Well, the purpose of the West is what I just presented. That's the purpose of the United States as an independent country, the American Republic, and the American superpower. That's our point of view, what I just presented. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, the idea that we want to have other countries as well as our own, and all the sections of the United States have a chance at a modern life. To do that, you have to approach these other sections and these other peoples with respect, just as we want to be approached with respect and have an equal station among the powers of the earth. And we want to have those people, even the white Southerners, decide that this is in their interest to have development. American Indians, the same thing would have been. They weren't given that choice. Their old way of life was wrecked, but they weren't given a new way of life in our system. Not really. What about China? What about Russia? What about Iran? What about all these other countries? Do we want them to become powerful? Of course we do, from our own interest as a country, as a nation. The world is much safer, not just with nuclear weapons, but all the time, is much safer if there are many, many countries that are powerful and that are civilized and that are sharing civilization. Of course, civilization means sharing. That's the very definition of it. That's what the Greeks were most proud of, is their relations to strangers and foreigners when they were good, before they became imperialists and fell. So the United States as a nation favors the rise of other countries. What is China doing that upsets the present rulers of the United States and Britain? They are rising themselves, and they're facilitating the rise of half the rest of the world right now. We used to do that. That's who the United States is. U.S. has no other identity. What's the U.S. today? Nobody has a clue about what the U.S. is now. Is it defined by Trump? Not really. He did some things against the globalists, but he didn't define what the U.S. is. He didn't really invoke history. He didn't tell the people what's going on. He could have addressed this problem in Central and South America easily. Didn't touch it. He could have addressed the offshore banking system. He could have addressed the Kennedy assassination. Maybe he touched on it somewhere, but none of that. Biden, nobody knows what Biden is about, right? Beyond being a fool. So what is the United States? The United States prefers civilization and was the fountain of civilization in the formative stages of the modern era, well into the 20th century and revived by Kennedy and FDR for the world. Otherwise, the United States, it has no identity and doesn't really have any independent voice. So when the United States puts pressure on other countries not to imitate the United States and rise, what is that? And why wouldn't you point that out in the discussion? The discussion is otherwise completely groundless and foolish. I can't stress that enough. The issue is the right to rise, the urgent need to rise in new powers, in understanding the secrets and laws of nature to use them for man's benefit, to protect our future, protect the environment as well as protecting the human capital and the human environment, and make try to have some beauty in our society. So that is what the US stands for. Otherwise, if you're putting pressure on people not to rise, not to follow the path that the US took, don't tell me about authoritarianism. That's not the issue. What government is good right now? Seriously, would you really want to live under you wouldn't want to live in a theocratic dictatorship in Iran. You might get in trouble. You might get in trouble in any country, no matter how favorable their government is to the right policy. And of course, you'll get in trouble in the United States and Britain. So it's not a matter of what the government is. It's what is the country all about? What's the aim of the country? And what's the aim of the leaders? Why are they authoritarians? Why do they do dictatorial things? Why do they try to stop foreign interventions in their country? Because the foreigners are trying to destroy their country and stop them from rising. What about if you stopped doing that and had railroads going high speed now and other things going through all these countries by cooperative means? Same thing as we did in the South. Take that as a heuristic device. That will open them up in a positive way. Only fools in China would be opposed to having high-speed rail lines that connect all the countries. The best people certainly want that. But what would that do to China or Russia? Or North Korea? Wouldn't that open them up to foreign influence? Sure, why not? So what? It would also open up the United States to foreign influence. That's good too, right? We might learn something. So what I'm saying is that the dictatorship issue is a sad joke when what the policy of the US and Britain is to deliberately provoke dictatorship by trying to overthrow, not just to overthrow their governments, but to stop them from doing precisely what the US did, which is to advance civilization. That's the issue. Not anything less than that about tactics in a war. And I agree with you that this was forced on them. And of course, they're fighting NATO now and so forth. But NATO is not, you have to think of NATO. NATO killed Kennedy. NATO is this faction of the Pentagon and the CIA and British intelligence. I saw a very good video a few days ago, produced about a year ago. It's called "The Man Who Knew Too Much," and it's produced by in Britain. It's about British intelligence and how they lie all the time. The same title from a Hitchcock movie, but this is about them faking everything in Northern Ireland. And then this military intelligence unit that did that was tasked with faking incriminating things against the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. This is British intelligence, military intelligence, and run through MI6. And so who is that? What is that? What's their objectives? This isn't a government. The government is not the issue. The government is what they were trying, the British government they were trying to overthrow. Just like Kennedy was our government. Don't say the government killed Kennedy. That's absurd. Kennedy was the government. So government, in a sense, is not the issue. We have a right to have a government, self-government. But the issue is this right to rise. And this enemy that we've pretty well defined doesn't agree with that. And they don't agree with our country. It's as simple as that. Don't start with culture wars. Start with this history. The right to rise.
Yeah, that's good. It reframes the whole discussion into a much healthier, principled place rather than getting into a nitpicking debate about which nation is better or worse. It's not about it's who has the right, like you said, to not who has the right, but who's fighting for their right to develop and to make life better for their people and for the world that they're a part of, and who's not doing that. And then you can look at the oligarchy as something different from any particular nation per se, and get into a much more truthful position in a dialogue with other people who are confused. That's very good.
Any other questions?
Oh yeah, we got a lot. So right now we've got a list of
I'll
about
try
six...
to make a short answer so that other people can
Okay,
talk.
cool.
Sorry.
So let's no, it's good. Context is everything.
I saved that up for the question and answer. Go ahead.
Well, let's do it this way. I'm not going to do in total order, but I feel like Marty's question kind of plays off of some of the elements you brought up. So we'll do Marty, then Jerry, Madeline. Anyway, Marty, go for it.
Oh, thank you. And Matt, can you hear me? Because I've had problems. Oh,
And
thank you,
see you.
guys. That's important. Not too much to say. Well, I always say that before saying too much. But at first, Anton, thank you. A master for. One cannot listen to you without being amazed at how much history we do not know and you have uncovered. Thank you again. What you've just delivered, especially on the crucial importance on the railroads, it again opens up huge new areas for research, and again examples of hope as well as despair to go ahead. Also, of course, I wish I didn't, because I fully agree with your analysis and the dilemmas we're in now. And I wish I didn't, because the prognosis is therefore so depressing. What I fear happening in Ukraine now is that they have become victims of their own myths, victims of their own lies, victims of their own rhetoric, and they are pulling the entire United States and the entire Western world on the path towards suicide. Because as you and a couple of other, as you have rightly pointed out, the Russians are facing an existential threat now, just as Lincoln and the Union were in the Civil War.
You agree they need to stop the war? I mean, this is
yes,
a disaster
exactly.
for the world.
And I mean, just now what I see predict happening in Ukraine, and I pray I'm wrong, but I see it very clearly, is our neocon chorus are leading the charge, and Biden and company are executing it flawlessly to encourage the Ukrainians to throw away an entire generation of youth again in a mass attack that can only result in mass deaths, like the British Army faced on the Somme and the German Army in 1918 when Ludendorff attacked with them. But they don't care, because they have a backup plan, they imagine. And their backup plan is that, that they will flood the Western media with fake compassion for Ukraine to brainwash the British and American peoples to allow direct US and NATO military intervention in Ukraine, which they think will finally crack Russia. And of course it won't, but it will drive the world even closer to the threat of nuclear confrontation. Or over the brink. And yes, exactly. I wish you disagreed with me, you understand, because then there would be more hope that I was wrong. I pray we are both wrong on that. But the one other thing I'd say is, it struck me listening to your presentation at the end here, that when we have presidents like William McKinley, who was a nationalist and was very reluctantly pulled against himself into the Philippine War, and as you well know better than I, was determined not to annex Hawaii and expand in the Pacific, and therefore had to be removed and eliminated. And when we have a president like Warren Harding, whose achievements in only 2.5 years are quite astonishing, they have to be neutered in history, even though they're hugely popular at the time. One never reads that the mourning for Warren Harding was as great as the mourning and grief for President Roosevelt in 1945.
Yeah.
That's being removed from history. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, why don't you, yeah, you know, Harding pardoned Eugene Debs, and the Attorney General said he met him and he was a great guy. So this is a right-wing conservative, so-called president, who's a realist, and he says that don't be insane. What do we want? We have our own business to develop, and we want to advance civilization. So you got these communists, they're not right, we're right. So what? Let's go ahead, you know. And so he was a normal person. Probably the worst thing he did, I think one of his chief enemies was the young Dulles brothers, by the way, at that time. But I'd like to, let's try to get some other people, you know, asking some questions. You know, cool. These are wonderful things to explore. I love all those things you were bringing up. Go ahead.
All right. Well, we got Paul. You still there, Paul?
Unmute. Yeah.
Who's that?
Paul here. Anton.
I don't see you. Paul who?
Kettle. I don't know. Yeah.
Where
Paul
is it?
On the screen. Well, maybe I'm buried somewhere.
Oh, here. Wait a minute.
I see you.
Oh, there you are. I see you. You're okay in the green shirt. Go ahead.
Just some guy.
Right here. Oh, you got.
Thank you very much. It's very rich. I enjoy so much your presentation. I was very excited to hear that you were coming on tonight, because I saw one tape recorded presentation from you a year ago or so, where you and that really impressed me. Thank you. But the question is, I wonder if in that presentation at the end you emphasized that this result for the United States history, us resolving our problems going forward, it was important that we resolve the questions around the Native Americans and maybe the racial questions. I'm not sure quite how to say it. And you emphasized that. And I wanted to, and I thought that was very, very insightful. Really, yes, I see what you're getting at. And I would just want to ask you now is, do you have any more thoughts that you would like to share with us on that subject?
Let me just go back very quickly over one little thing that I mentioned here today. When the ambassador from China came to the United States, that's in the late 1860s, this is an anti-racist American who was sent by the Chinese. He got here during the fight over Reconstruction, over the rights of the blacks in the South, famous rights questions about whether we'll have not the end of slavery, because that was Lincoln's while he was still alive, the 13th Amendment, but the 14th and 15th Amendments and other things, confiscation and so forth, protection of the black people. So those things were being fought out. When he arrived to get a treaty, he worked with Secretary of State Seward to get a treaty to override the racialist point of view that was previously expressed by the United States through our government, when that government had been controlled by the Southern slave owners. In the 1840s, they got a treaty, a bad treaty, and his job was to get a new treaty with the USA. The two questions, the racial ideas of white people towards China and towards Black people, were completely raised at the same time. If you go back to the American Revolution, you have the same phenomenon. The question of slavery was being battled out in the colonial legislatures. They were anti-slavery. There were attempts to ban slavery, which were overridden by the British Crown and by the Parliament. At the same time, the American colonists, the revolutionaries, were completely aware of what the British were doing in India and the Indians' resistance against that. And so these were completely joined as principles in the minds of people. I don't know how, I haven't completely studied Colin Lowry and his mother and father dealt with, studied these things intensively. And Nancy Spanis has written a new book about this, about to be published, about this side of the slavery question. But think of this now, of the combination of the internal racial issues in the United States relating to racial minorities here, including the Hispanics coming from Latin America, combined with these live questions at the same time, with the same sides on the two sides of these issues about our relations and ideas concerning Asians of different colors, South Sea Islanders, and other people, Africans, whether they're Black Africans or Arabs or other types of people who are not part of this, white European or Anglo-Saxon, which became the Anglo-Saxon monstrosity in my view, despite the good heritage there. But the best way to look at this racial question is to go back to what I presented today. You'll have to read this book when it comes out, or I can, really interested people I can work with and give you a copy of this chapter. I'm not even finished with it yet. I'm almost done with it. But look at this, what I presented today about the people who are nation builders, who built up our biggest industries, who are trying to, and who perfected the efficiency and skills of our country. These are scientists, inventors, and industrialists, and also labor leaders in this period in particular. That's the American heritage. Unless you see the two sides in the United States, and even in England, you can trace those two sides there in the belly of the beast, and in Scotland, and in Ireland. But unless you see in America those two sides and see our side as the American side, that's the way to look at it. Henry Carey wasn't the chief spokesman for the nationalists, that is the chief strategist for the nationalists. He was the chief strategist for the United States. That's clear. Certain presidents fulfilled that position also, but only certain ones. You have to have a more sophisticated, not sophisticated. You have to start with the problem of sympathy. Start with that. And then look for where human beings fought for the right and justice, and did it with maturity, so that, and experience and knowledge and skill, so that they could take responsibility for the outcome and make a good outcome, and not just screw things up, or worse, get into ideological crusades that become crazy, like the French Revolution or something else. So this is the answer, my answer to these racial questions. Go to these militants in the Reconstruction period who were fighting for Black rights. I'm talking about white people, but also there's Frederick Douglass, who was on this side. He was a nationalist. He recruited Black soldiers to the Union Army. Harriet Tubman was a spy for the Union Army, for Lincoln. Also, Frederick Douglass was a critic of Lincoln, and a gadfly, just as Thaddeus Stevens was, the white man. But they had common objectives. And this objective is the uplifting of all mankind. So that's our heritage. Unless you keep this in mind, and you have this in every country, you have this in India, you have this in China, you have this in Russia, this history of these fighters for justice and who have the world in mind and who know about it. That's the heritage. You have to look at these racial questions that way, from the standpoint of a philosopher, strategist in each country collaborating with a similar person in other countries to try to get progress for everybody. That's how you deal with these racial things and prejudices. You also change the social arrangements in the country, so you bring railroads and outside world in, like Vita said, you how do you get rid of ignorance in Russia and the peasant who thinks that his little village is the whole world and doesn't know more than 500 words? Get the railroad in there and get him into other places and get other people into his village. Don't allow this kind of isolation.
Yeah.
But don't say you're going to do it by force. Cooperation. Cooperation is the same thing as civilization. Cooperation and peace are the same thing. Cooperation and progress are the same thing. That's the answer to the racial issue cannot be dealt with in some other way. And we all know that from the current horse shit about solving police brutality without raising any of the history. Should people who are fighting for Black rights today or for minority rights, should they not take the Union side in history? Should they not be favorable to that? Do they know about that? And shouldn't that be something that wasn't the end of slavery worth anything? You talk about the beginning of slavery. How about the end of slavery? 200,000 Blacks were determinative in that fight. So that you have this history, this heritage is the only way to approach the racial issue.
Very well said. Very well said. Bruce.
Tan, your book is great, Who We Are. I finished it maybe a week or two ago.
Oh.
And yeah.
Oh, thank you. You said you would.
Good Lord. Yeah. As our conversations like this, kudos again, Matt, Cynthia, and everyone. And I like to stand on all men are created equal from the Declaration of Independence. And only those laws are good based on the consent of the governed. That used to be taught in American public schools back in my day. For all I know, it still is, but if it is, it doesn't seem to stick with the young people. And this insight into the nationalists in our history and this fight for the ability to rise, the ability to cooperate, to improve oneself is a very tangible tool, Anton. And Matt, you're so much of what you teach and publish has really taught me a lot about that. And I just had a book come out 2 years ago, and I wasn't known by anybody. And in those 2 years, just by repeating what I have read and learned from knowledgeable folks like you, has, lets me bring these things out to more people. So I just want to say something to anyone who doesn't post about these things, doesn't have a Substack, doesn't reshare more and more of these kind of things. Just keep doing that, because the race is on, the time is urgent. But just something about, we would all agree about all men are created equal and we all have rights, but so much of this history, Anton, it just shows how real and vital the battle is. It's just refreshing, because it tells me, it's the same as it ever was. And I don't have to care if I win in my lifetime, because this was the battle 200 years ago. I'm sure it was the battle 2,000 years ago. And even Lincoln summed it up. It's the perpetual battle between those who say, I'll eat what you work to produce.
Right.
The rights of humanity versus the rights of the divine right of kings.
Right.
And that might ever be the battle for we humans. So great to comprehend some tangible things that could help us educate and inspire more people.
Let me say something about the history of what I've been talking about. That is the writing of the history. What happened to that? Of course, at the time and right after the Civil War, the old Confederate leaders, the worst of them, put out and they had the power to publish through different organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan and so forth, the story that the war was about northern aggression, but the Reconstruction was vengeance by these radical politicians like Thaddeus Stevens. They sometimes in those days would throw in stuff about tariffs, but that's not something that the oligarchs later on would like you to be thinking about. So, but anyway, this idea became a hegemonic historical idea. That is, there was a Columbia University professor named Dunning, and the Dunning school around him, that is the tendency among historians that agreed with him about what was Reconstruction. And it was the valiant president who came in after Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, who tried to stop the radicals from punishing the South. And this nonsense, avoiding all of what I've been talking about, avoiding all of the conflict over the headline issues of the day, became the standard idea about Reconstruction for a long time. There was attacked somewhat in the so-called progressive era, but then in the 20th century, there was an outstanding history writer named C. Vann Woodward, C.VANN Woodward. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he had students there who became very good historians as well. And he said this whole idea of the Dunning School and people who compromise with this are crazy. It's totally wrong. The South did not eliminate Black rights right after the Civil War. They weren't allowed to. That came later when Reconstruction was destroyed. And in cooperation with Northeastern people, the same people doing the immigration restriction, the Boston people, the Anglophiles, the free world, the free trade people. So that he wrote The Strange Career of Jim Crow. He also wrote about the compromise of the 1876 elections that led to the presidency of Hayes. Very important, because a deal was proposed to settle that election. It was a tie in the Electoral College. A deal was proposed by Tom Scott, the then president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And that deal was that the South would be developed by internal improvements from the federal government, plus the backing of this new transcontinental from Texas to San Diego. And this is something that the South wanted, all this development. In exchange for that, he said that we should have the Republican become president, and he can take the troops out of the South. So we're not punishing the South, we're benefiting the South, but the old South will disappear. Why should the South be a separate section and a political pest on the country, a disaster for the country? Do things for their benefit and solve the problem. And it was on that basis that the election was decided. The Republican nominee Hayes came to Washington in Tom Scott's private railroad car. And C. Van Woodward wrote about this in his book, in his article, a huge article about the 1876-77 compromise on Reconstruction, the Tom Scott plan. And what happened is that the Northeastern financiers, the London, Boston, New York axis, which is still with us, it has other additions, but that's the basis of it. They controlled the president, they controlled the new administration, and they took the troops out of the South without changing the South, without bringing in the investment and federal or otherwise. Morgan took over the old Scott network of railroads, became the Southern Railway. And yes, they had some industries in Tennessee and Northern Alabama, making iron and mining coal, but it was all done by convicts. It was done deliberately so as not to improve those areas. Sadistic, real sadism, I must say. These people don't call them Satanists, because that's getting you into shaky ground. You know, I actually don't even believe that Satan exists. I've been called a heretic for that. But anyway, but they are what some people would define that. So anyway, this is what happened. He wrote that history. You can look it up. And we now have I'll just end this. We now have a woke history that also completely eliminates the objectives of the two sides in our history. Completely obliterates that.
Thank you. I want to put a cherry on this to let others ask you questions, Anton, and just thank you for the many ways you define civilization in your talk today. Sharing, cooperation, and
respect.
Respect. Great. Which is all versus everything about empire, oligarchy might be summed up by hierarchy. Because if it's the consent of the governed, we have to converse, to negotiate, to create the rules for ourselves. If we're a constitutional republic, let alone a democracy, I know we're a constitutional republic. We are supposed to have a voice and compromise and negotiate because we all have an equal say in it, or we send representatives to the table representing our interests. So cooperation, civilization versus having to be anybody's inferior. And that follows, where did I start? All people are created equal, and it's to rise up to that occasion. It's part of becoming an adult. And God bless us, everyone.
We need it.
Amen. All right. We got Jerry. You still there, Jerry?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm trying to
Okay.
find you. Oh, there you are. Oh, wow.
Hello, Tony.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I always enjoy hearing from you. I have about 100 questions, but
Okay, shoot.
I'm gonna pick one. I want to ask you about Philadelphia
Yeah,
and the discussion, you gave us on this, the railroad crowd, the steel plants, this whole industrialization movement seems to be centered in Philadelphia.
yes.
I was doing some reading on something else on Rembrandt Peale, and I came across something you wrote a while ago on Central High School,
Yes.
Philadelphia.
Wonderful.
And it's like, I think it was the first high school in the United States, and they had, the principal of it was Alexander Dallas Beige. I mean, probably the foremost scientific mind in the United States at the time,
Yeah.
is running the high school. And the guy he's working with, Rembrandt Peale, that I was reading about, is probably the greatest mind on artistic education in the United States at the time. And he wrote the whole art curriculum. And I know there is some connection between that grouping. I think it was in the 1820s, maybe, when they started Central High School, and this later grouping in Reconstruction. I mean, it probably goes back to Ben Franklin, the Fruits of Franklin. But if you could talk about that a bit more, I'd love to hear whatever you have to say on that, Tony.
Yeah, Beige, the first president of the school, the high school in Philadelphia, Central High School, was actually started, I believe, in the 1850s. And he had previously been the head research scientist at the Franklin Institute. So he was in the middle of a lot of the projects to develop the country. Then he became, with more, he went to Europe. He was sent by Nicholas Biddle's money, who had a fund from Girard Bank, and $2 million. They sent him to Europe, and he got in with the greatest scientists in the world, Gauss and Weber and others, and Humboldt. And they started a world organization of scientists, the Magnetische Verein. And they had good people in every country, Russia and in England. And this was a comradeship of the scientists who were also these nation builders. They had very good people in France. And so Beige became the leading science policy man in America. He was the head of the Coast Survey. He produced a map for Lincoln of all of the density of slavery in different counties, county by county. So Lincoln would have an idea of where the sympathy for the North would be, where it wasn't so dense, right? And otherwise, he was part of the group of scientists that defined the loyalty within the military for Lincoln. And of course, the loyalty is based on the principles, not just somebody who salutes the flag with more fervor. That's bullshit, right? What's your idea, right? Are you really loyal to what we're fighting for, the Union, and what that's about? So Beige and his friends overlap in many ways the industrial progress that took place. Was Silliman is in this network, and he was the chief scientist for defining the oil industry for Pennsylvania first, and then California for Tom Scott, and so forth. They were involved with the development of the steel industry. At Central High School, by the way, they had an observatory and an astronomical observatory and a good telescope. So this is, it would put people to shame in other things today. They don't even have laboratories in a lot of schools. They have packets of information. And you better be in favor of science, even if you can't do any of it yourself, you know? So people should look up these people.
Yeah, Cynthia and I were just talking on the sideline here. This is fascinating, and this curriculum and what the method of teaching by Beish by Peel, is this something you've written and published somewhere, Anton? And Jerry, are you going to publish something on this as well?
I wrote a whole series called American Prometheus. Remember?
Of course, that's in there.
And that was in it.
Okay,
Beish is one of the stars of that thing. I didn't feature him as much in this because he was very non-political.
Huh.
So he was friends with everybody, no matter what their political opinions were.
Right. Kind of reminds me of Alexander von Humboldt as well. He's just talking to everybody and just trying to find anybody who's got sparks of goodwill and humanity to work with and mobilize. He's just everywhere.
That's right.
Cool. Magdalena.
Okay, finding my unmute button here. Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Tony. Oh, that was a real pleasure. And I wanted to thank you. You clarified something for me because I gave a talk some time ago about the Reconstruction. And I made the point there that it was quite amazing that you would have 3 amendments being pushed through within a 5-year period. The 13th Amendment, 1860, and then the 15th.
65.
65, and then the 15th on the 1870, right? And then I was very happy to hear, because I didn't make the connection about the 13th Amendment making this point about using conviction of a crime that you can then put people back in slavery. And I thought, oh my God, of course, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
This whole thing that they used as the black coats in the South, right?
Yeah. There's no reason to have that in the thing. It's a trap.
Yeah, I was anyway. You just blew me away with that. Okay, thank you. I got that finally done. Okay, and then I wanted you to talk a little bit more about this whole Pennsylvania crew. I mean, yes, there was Benjamin Franklin, but this whole Pennsylvania crew must have come out from his school. There's Iron Pig Kelly and Stephen Caldwell and George W. Scranton. All these people were firmly on the side of fighting for development and against free trade, I believe. That's my. So can you elaborate a little bit more? How did this grouping?
These people were actually a political minority in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania most often voted for Jackson and the Democrats. So you have to really have a strong stomach to wade through political history. And if you start with political history, you'll get nowhere. You can't find any of this. You can't find out what was going on in the country from, quote, political history. It's like people analyzing the different presidents. This guy was better, this guy was good, blah, blah, blah. So in Pennsylvania, there was a particular principle of Franklin. What was his principle? What was his legacy? He expressed this in the colonies first, and then in England, when he lived there for 18 years. And the principle was the happiness of mankind in the progress of mankind, and the happiness of mankind in promoting that for others. And this is pure, to me, it's purely Platonic. Of course, it's also Christian, but that's hard to deal with, because, as Gandhi said, the Christian religion is the best one in the world. Somebody should try it sometime. So in other words, what the principle of Franklin was proceeding from his own activity and from his constant shower of aid and suggestions and concrete help in setting up institutions and moving individuals and helping individuals, and also undermining with his own satire, like Swift, what the enemy is up to. And remember, he's in the British empire. He's a Briton in America, or he's an American within that. So he is actually starting to define what it means to be American, just like the Puritans did, and some of the people in Virginia did, like Washington. But the person who most perfectly, I think, establishes this identity of the USA is Franklin, and the principle is this idea, a new idea of republicanism. And as has been said, just by the last person, that self-government is this is what we're talking about. The self-government is identified with the interest of the people. It's not just that they have the right to vote on something and decide something, but what is their interest? Their interest, their self-interest as a people is in having a better life. Whether they say it or not, sometimes they're too shy or too beaten down to say that I deserve better than I'm getting. What if they're a convict? What if they're destitute? What if they're an addict? What if there's something else? You know, everybody has the right to have a better life and to be a better person. Franklin represents that principle, and that's the essence of self-government. It isn't choosing things, because you have the right to choose whatever. You could choose to become a new sex. You could choose to become a new species. That's not the issue. The issue is, do you have a right to have a better life? And to do that requires scientific progress and the advancement of the whole civilization, the whole skill set and association of diverse trades and trade. It requires all those things, but particularly the progress of industrial powers, agricultural success, and scientific agriculture, and so forth. So self-government and progress defined this way become identified. It's the right to have material progress and scientific progress as the right of a people. This is particularly identified with Franklin, and it becomes the theme of the nationalists in Philadelphia. It becomes the center of world republicanism defined in that way. Throughout from the time of the American Revolution, with Matthew Carey and Hamilton, who's living there in Philadelphia, and some other people in Philadelphia around Franklin at the Revolution, it goes through Matthew Carey, it goes through his son, it goes through Henry Clay, defers to Matthew Carey as his teacher. And he's not from Philadelphia, but Philadelphia becomes identified with this idea of progress as self-government. This becomes the world center for the 19th century. I'll say this again that other people have heard before. I've heard me say, in 1963, when Kennedy was murdered, the Encyclopedia Britannica yearbook that was published that year said, well, it's too bad he was killed, but in a sense, it's good, because at least it establishes the fact that we're not going to have any more 19th century nationalism. Now, when Lincoln was murdered, an article was published right after he died in this New York Social Science Review, and I quote it in my book and what I'm writing now. This was a social science movement in the United States, was set up principally by John Stuart Mill. It came from England and went through Boston. So they published an article right after Lincoln was murdered about why it wasn't such a bad thing that he was murdered. And it was good that this wise man Andrew Johnson took his place. And one of the central ideas in it was that, beside Lincoln wasn't smart and everything, as smart as this fellow Johnson, was that Lincoln was surrounded by advisors and by people that had these terrible beliefs in railroads and industry and tariffs and cheap money. And so that's what he would have done if he'd survived. So thank God he's dead. And so now the whole idea, their idea in Reconstruction is making sure that Lincoln's ideas and agenda don't survive him. But that's where this comes from. It's the ideas defined by Franklin that became identified to much of the leadership of mankind, the leadership, intellectual and statesmen who had aspirations in other countries. Their center of reference is Philadelphia, and Benjamin Franklin in particular, for many reasons, because he's the happiest man in the world. Why not go with him? Like in one movie, what's her name, had a fake orgasm, and the woman next to her said, "Well, I'll have what she's eating." It was in a restaurant. So I'll have what Franklin's doing. He's the happiest man in the world. I'll go with him. Sorry for that bad analogy, but I thought, you might as well use a little bit of humor sometimes.
Yeah, I think that was as good as it gets, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
When Harry met Sally.
Yes, that's it. That's it. When Harry met Sally.
When Harry met Sally. Okay. Yeah, Cynthia yelled that for the other room too. So two people get the point for that. All right. So we have time for two more questions. Two people got in. We got Peter and we got Herinder. I was just thinking quickly. I just wanted to share a thought that awoke as you were speaking. If people have become very cynical, and we're all very, very much prepared to admit that good people can become corrupt and good nations can become corrupt. But to see how corrupt nations can become good is very difficult for many of our jaded people in our world today to really wrap their minds around. But that is all, without understanding that, you can't understand how human history happened. And just in our present age, look at Saudi Arabia. Would anybody have won a bet 5 years ago that Saudi Arabia was going to do what it's doing right now and embrace a Saudi Vision 2030 pro-industrial high-speed rail program with Russia and China as like cooperative partners and build peace relations back with Iran and Syria? Hell's no. And, are there a lot of things to criticize about Saudi Arabia? Of course. But when you're actually operating on a level of reasonable statecraft, you don't just go and label everybody the bad guy and try to punish them or shame them. You want to look for points of awakening the genuine self-interest in the people that you necessarily are. They're living right there. The Saudis are there. Do they not want to have a better life? Did the Confederate, were they still racist after the Civil War? Yes. Was there still something human that was capable of being awoken if a better responsible idea of economics was provided? Yeah, and that would probably be the same thing for Ukraine too. If any durable reconstruction, and it has to happen, can occur outside of nuclear war, then that would have to be the framework that is adopted in the case of Ukraine or Israel or anything. So yeah, it's a very, very breath of fresh air, your approach here.
Helen just put in a comment that I saw that said, the world at large, the people are fed up. And so I would say, well, the world at large, many people are not well fed. And so we could do something about that. If Africa got electricity, the way to think about these and combat cynicism is to say, get a diabolical grin on you and say, how can we change this thing? How can we go around these stupid guys? They're suicidal. So why have them running things? Anyway, so there's many ways to do that, but you have to start with the idea that this has to be done. We have to get this progress. You can't leave people dying of hunger or sitting where they want to make advancements. You said you had a couple more, or what?
Yeah, we have time for two more. So Peter, I'll ask first, and then Harinder, I'll ask first, then Peter. So Harinder, just keep. I'm asking both you guys just to keep it short because we have maybe 10 minutes max. So
hi Anton, thanks for the presentation.
Hi.
So everything you've said about democracy, about what you said about Africa, what you have said about science, Franklin's approach that science would advance the world, has been negated and falsified by the people who have taken over the West, and that includes America, because America is where this 1776 revolution took place. And so it was very important that they crush whatever vestiges of freedom and republicanism existed. So, for example, as you know, the First Amendment is under attack. Very few people could talk about what was happening with the vaccines. Anybody who tries to expose the CO2 hoax is marginalized, silenced. So that's the dilemma we face, is that everything, all the things that you said are absolutely correct, and all those things are being used. They're being cited by the very globalists in order to impose a dictatorship. For instance, the Rockefellers started out as philanthropists, and Gates also is pretending to be a philanthropist to help people. He's promoting a food initiative in Africa, but it's going to achieve the exact opposite. It's going to kill more people. It is already killing people. So these ideas have been hijacked by the globalists, and that's the dilemma we face. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I have a thought about that. I believe that the history of the best in America and the best in China and India, that is the Indian subcontinent, and Russia, and maybe a few other places, but I'm talking about especially in this modern period, going up through when it all went bad in America. But the relations between those big countries, USA, China, India, and Russia, is really what you need to focus on, I believe, because they are natural allies. There's no doubt about that. They have exactly the same interests as nations. They're also large nations, and their future is in common. When somebody says that the United States has different interests or competing interests, say with China, or the US is trying to break India or Pakistan away from China or away from each other or this or that, you have to go back to the history that I'm talking about. Is this an obscure history? Can this be found easily in the history of each of these countries? Yes, it can. There's no other history for these countries, just like for the USA, than this history of development by people who believed in developing mankind from high principles. Of course, in China and India, this goes back thousands of years. In Russia, it goes back not so long ago. I mean, but still longer than the USA. But you can find, now I'm not just talking about like the revolt of India against the American Revolution or the Chinese standing up to the opium thing. I'm talking about people promoting the industrial progress and scientific progress, and on the highest level as well as applications. Do you know anything about are you have anything to do with India?
I'm Indian born, yeah.
Okay. You know about the Tata family, right?
Yes.
All right. So they have their most very prominent industrialists to this day. I think somebody, well, I think some other family owns the Pennsylvania Steel Company, founded by Pennsylvania Railroad, but they're still in this business. They set up the steel industry in India at the beginning of the 20th century in cooperation with the Pennsylvania steelmakers. They went to America. They were referred by Hanna, the advisor to McKinley, to go to the leading engineer for these, for these old steelmakers before Morgan, Julian Kennedy. And he went back to India with them and helped them, it was their project, set up their steel mills, the first ones. He also did that in Russia. So this is a principle in all over the world, really. There's a nationalist, oh God, I can't remember his name, in the 19th century. Anyway, it's not, it doesn't matter. But you have people who have knowledge of this fight in the West, of these factions in the West. And as you know, the fight for Indian independence was coherent with the Irish fight. They had relations with Sinn Féin, with the Indian nationalists. But the beyond the politics, the idea of sublime and transformative science that has a profound effect, city building and metalworking and transportation and navigation and astronomy and all these things, new and ancient, are coherent with what I'm talking about. You have this in every country. People remember in their own culture this background. I've recently learned some new things about that in Central America and Mexico. There was a civilization in what's now the Amazon jungle that was quite advanced. But anyway, this history of the USA taking the lead in the world against imperialism in the 19th century, and again through Franklin Roosevelt, which he tried to do in South America and by cooperation with Russia, and then again, however briefly, with John Kennedy. And there were others, as Martin brought up about Harding and some other people. When our presidents were not crazy, they were of this kind. Unfortunately, you could define many of them as really just worthless and sort of crazy. But this principle put forward by the best of them is perfectly coherent with the nationalists and nation builders of the other three countries. They are natural allies. And the future of the world depends on those four countries working together. There isn't any other future, I'm sorry.
Which is why the captured US is now involved, controlled by the globalists, in the attempt to destroy Russia using Ukraine.
Yeah, that's true.
On a similar war against China using Taiwan. But I will leave a positive development that has come out of that, aside from globalization. There's a gentleman called Scott Ritter. He's a retired guy. So he's just come back from a book tour in Russia, and he reports that the sanctions have also backfired in another way, that all the Russian oligarchs who were used to sending hundreds of billions of dollars outside Russia are now afraid those funds will be stolen, and they have been forced to reinvest in Russia. And so a lot of Russian cities are now having plenty of funds for infrastructure development. He also said that he visited a number of cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Novosibirsk, and there is no problem. The shelves in the shops are full. They're doing well. The economy is doing well. So that's one positive thing, that the attempt to wreck Russia has backfired in a big way. Mm-hmm. And this alliance that you talked about, India and China will have their dispute, but this de facto alliance, India with Russia and China with Russia, is what is the Iran in Saudi Arabia and all the rest.
Growing with other countries coming into it, yeah.
That's the future. That was Thank you.
So now my Jewish friend, Peter Nikitas.
Yeah. All right, Peter. You're gonna close this up for us.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Thank you, Anton. Thank you, Martin. So I have a couple questions. On Reconstruction, can you comment on the efforts to adopt proportional representation or semi-proportional representation election systems in the United States during the Reconstruction period? And can you comment on the label that Arthur Kanoy, a famous lawyer in New York, and Howard Zinn applied to the 1876, 1877 decisions as the Great Betrayal?
Yes. On the second one, well, let's go to the first thing. You said proportional representation. This was an idea about having a parliamentary system, really, in the United States. It came from the real person who promoted that mostly was John Stuart Mill in England, and it was put through the American Association for Social Science, for the promotion of social science. They had a British organization by the same name, and they set up American branch, a real branch of that in Boston. And there was a guy named Simon Stern in New York who published that rotten thing, the New York Social Science Review that I said, that had that article about why it was good that Lincoln was killed. So Simon Stern was in this closely allied with the British reformers, like reformers of America. What's his name? John Stuart Mill and others. British liberal imperialists. And this idea for proportional representation was to allow somebody to vote more, what they would say in a more fair and sophisticated way, by having the outcome of the voting be parties with proportional representation, not just an either or for a candidate, but maybe you have 2 or 3 votes, I guess, and you get to choose your first choice, your second choice. I think there's different variations, but the idea is to have several parties in the parliament or the Congress, so to sort of scrap the Constitution in a way, and this would be a fairer representation. The problem with this is that there is no discussion there that I saw about the contrasting purpose of the British government and the American government. And the central idea of the history, which is self-government. What is the opposite of self-government? Well, you can't say it is kings, because a king could be really the representative of the popular will. Yes, they used to elect kings in England, and some kings were good or did good. What is the opposite of our system? The opposite is secret government. It's government by people who are not elected. They're not in the parliament. Who is this British intelligence group that ran the information unit that falsified everything against the Irish rebels and then attacked the British government? What is that? Who elected them? What's the parliament have to do with that? Well, there's permanent agencies in the parliament and so forth, permanent government institutions. So what I'm saying is that a tactic or a technique of government, you always have to look at what is the principles of government that they are fixing or supposedly fixing. There may be something wrong with our government. There are, like the 13th Amendment it has this flaw in it. And the 14th and 15th Amendments did not have any enforcement in them. There's a lot of things that you could fix in the government, but you have to do it from the basis of the principle of the government especially to contrast it with what was wrong in Europe, which was they were all, or almost all, secret governments that served interests that the people knew nothing about. That's a simple fact. If you don't have to have a conspiracy theory, all you have to do is just say the people knew nothing about who's running the government. It wasn't people that were elected, or the people that did run the government forced the election of certain people to parliament. I suppose that you could say that. In any case, that's my comment on proportional representation. The other thing, the comment by Howard Zinn and others about the betrayal of the 1876-77 election. It went on until 1877 because it was a tie and Congress had to decide it. And they decided to end Reconstruction by taking the troops out. I discussed what happened to bring that about. But Howard Zinn is missing the question of the plantation system. Because what did you have in the South when you had that betrayal? You didn't just have the Ku Klux Klan and white racism. What did the black people in the South, leave the poor whites and the white, so-called white trash out of this. By the way, white trash was the term used by Atkinson in his book about cheap cotton in 1861. But what happened to the black people who were slaves, who stayed in the South? What did they do for a living? Well, they were forced to be plantation workers. Was it a good idea to keep the South rural, except for plantations that were big, a sort of a cotton growing factory of some sort, and then they dump this thing on the riverbank and they take it out by a steamship? Was that a good idea? Oh, well, that's none of our business. We're against capitalism. Well, you're not discussing what happened to those people. Is that none of your business? The northern radicals, that is the northeastern radicals of that type, led by Garrison. Remember, William Lloyd Garrison founded the Anti-Slavery Society, and then he worked with the British on this. There were good anti-slavery people in Britain. Don't mistake that. But Garrison's idea was that the United States itself was rotten. And his idea was, let's break up the country, let the southern side go out of the country with their slaves. Then America will be free of slavery. And when the Civil War ended, he was on the northern side in the Civil War, and he was favoring, emancipation and so forth. When the war ended, Garrison dissolved the Anti-Slavery Society. Some of these other people, honest people like Wendell Phillips and Butler from Massachusetts, were horrified. What the hell? What are you doing? It's not decided. So what Zinn is doing and whoever else, I forget the other guy you mentioned. What's the other person?
That was Arthur Kanoy, who was
the lawyer for the ACLU, right?
National Lawyers Guild, actually, and he was the
Lawyers Guild,
junior lawyer on the Rosenberg's defense team.
Yeah, well, that's good. I appreciate that, but I don't appreciate the conclusion, the shallow conclusion about this betrayal. Who's betraying? What was the betrayal? Who's behind it? What's it about? The betrayal is by these Anglophile, Northeastern, anti-national people who, in my view, are part of a system of assassination and lying that's been going on since the beginning of the country. They're criminals. And I don't say that about Kanoe or about Howard Zinn, but what they're not identifying the problem. There was a fight about whether to change the South. Don't have that anymore. And the abolitionists in Boston, most of them said, forget about it. We won the war, the slavery's over, so just leave the white people in charge. The worst offenders on that, in my view, is the Adams family. What a terrible tragedy. John Quincy Adams' son and grandsons went to the other side. They were total racists and bad in everything. And then Henry Adams is glorified as the great historian of America. That's part of the corruption of the history profession. Howard Zinn should go back and say what went wrong with Henry Adams. Why did he long to be identified with British aristocracy? What's that all about? Why did he hate his grandfather, John Quincy Adams? Tell me about that. What's going on? What was the American Revolution about? If you forget, drop saying that you hate the American Revolution. People write books now. Nancy Spanis told me about a book, a new biography of Samuel Adams, the great American revolutionary, who fought against slavery before the Revolution. And the new biography is an attack on Samuel Adams. Well, why would you attack Samuel Adams? Why would you choose that target? Because you hate the American Revolution, that's all. It's simple. Now, who today hates the American Revolution? What's that about? You don't need a conspiracy theory, just think it through. How about the people that fought against the American Revolution at the time? The imperialists. Oh, what about the Americans being part of that imperium now? People that have power, NATO, right? Well, they hate the American Revolution. They will have a flag and it might have, give me liberty or give me death, blah, 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 but they still hate the revolution for the principles that's involved. That's what this kind of nonsense is that talks about betrayal, but doesn't get into who the traitors were, really. And the traitors are the people that run the establishment now, right now, in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in the FBI, in NATO. And they're not the stupidest people at the bottom of those organizations, or even people that, many of them do daily jobs. Some of them get out or want to be a whistleblower or something, who knows? But who runs these things and for what purpose? People who hate the principles of the American Revolution. This is established by all of our history. That's the problem. Don't tell me about a betrayal and the country betrayed the South. Huh? Country betrayed the South? No, there's a fight. What are the two sides? You don't know about the two sides? Pity for you. Find out. That's it. And that's what you have to say, right? So that's what I'm writing this about, but other people have their own entries into this. But you can't allow somebody to base an attack on the USA from some crime committed in the name of the USA. There's no recognition of anything good that was ever done by any country in such a concept. That's my response to Zinn.
Yeah, it would be valuable if Zinn were able to hear this. We're alive and we're able to hear this. Because there were definitely some lessons he needed to learn that he refused to learn while he was still productive. Unfortunately.
Oh, he's died. I didn't even know he died.
I thought he died. Yeah, didn't he?
A long time ago. He died.
He died in 2010.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
maybe his those who have been influenced by his thinking might listen to this when it's up on YouTube and think twice about some of the axioms he held on to. He wrote
about the Zinns of America.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I love it.
Well, slavery, and I mean, it was the British Empire, but that is a major Zinn, and also the wiping out of the indigenous people. So there were some Zinns that
I have an appendix that I wrote for this the middle section of this book, and it's a little thing about the quoting from John Quincy Adams about the sins of America with respect to the natives, the Indians. And it's very instructive because he was president at the time when this was really starting to be fought out. And what he saw happening at that time, it wasn't like this all the time, but it was the same idea. He saw that the Southern slave owners in the Southern states encouraged and fought for the destruction of the Indian tribes and the takeover of their land, the grabbing of their lands. They did this partly because they were politicians trying to be elected to office by the Southerners, but also on principle that America cannot be allowed to be a republic. They have a contrary idea about that. A republic doesn't act that way. A real republic, a republic that Franklin founded, and Washington. Washington didn't allow private people to trade with the Indians when he was president. He set up government trading posts, and made treaties that were in many respects kept by the government. So Quincy Adams saw that those people who fought to destroy the Indians, to deprive them of their lands with no recourse, and disgraced the country by going back on our treaties, by just not even paying attention to the law, those were the slave owners. Those were the enemies of our country. And this, you can trace this out in the period after the Civil War with respect to the different objectives in the West of the two sides. One side, our side, wanted to develop, they wanted 500 million people in the Mississippi Valley and maybe a couple of 100 million in the West right away, like 100 million in the Mountain West. Bring in irrigation. Bring other means of bringing in a large population there. Yes, you're displacing the way of the buffaloes. You're breaking up the old way of life of the hunters. But you have now the resources and the massive job base and diversification of industry to offer a new way of life to the Indians whose old way of life you have disrupted. Instead of that, what happened? You have the other side. Who are the other side? Owners of diverse mining interests in North and South America, who are speculating with the minerals they take out. Owners of, 1,000 square mile cattle ranches. Do they want family farms? Do they want industries? No, their cattle won't be able to go anywhere they want and crap anywhere they want and eat anything. So that's an oligarchy that is global. They're always from some other country, or if they're here, they don't care about this country. That's the other side. They offered nothing to the Indians and always tried to elect presidents that would kill Indians and break the treaties, like Grover Cleveland did, who broke the treaties with the Apaches. So the two sides, in my view, in the West, were those who wanted to develop the West with civilization, and those who wanted simply to not just displace the Indians, but not to replace what they were with civilized Western style activities. They didn't want that. They didn't want America at its industrial and scientific and agricultural progress. They didn't want America to occupy the West. Those are the two sides. And the ones that wanted barons to rule those areas were the Indian killers. It wasn't really the U.S. military. Now it is the U.S. military. There's a lot of people that control the Pentagon policies that are insane. Crazy, the spoon benders. We all know about that. NATO, not even US. So those are two sides, and this is where you have to discuss the sin, as John Quincy Adams did. Disgusting. He was asked to be on the committee in the Congress to deal with the Indians, and he refused. because he was so disgusted with what the country was doing under Jackson and these other people that ran the country in those days. Yes, America, and in America's name, there were great sins committed. There was a fight about that by two sides who had two different principles and two different ideas and represents deadly, mortal, conflicting interests throughout the world. And there was a chance, there's always a chance for justice, but not without civilization. You got to have civilization to have justice. People who live in post-apocalyptic world have no justice. Revenge and just, you know, bloodlust or whatever, you'll never have justice. Never. Can only have it in civilization.
Anton, we always get more than we bargain for with you, and I really, really appreciate this master class. And I'm sure everybody has got a lot to chew on throughout the course of the week. A lot of mind food, a lot of soul food, and this is really great. When can we expect to see your volume 2?
Well, I'm close to the end of this chapter, and I've cut it down because I learned a lot while doing the work. I have 3 more chapters after this, and then I'm cutting it out. Well, no, let's see. It's actually 4 more, but it's all action. I don't have to really, I know the story already. I've worked it out, and I've been studying these other things as I went along, like the stuff I found out about Edison, personally building the power plants, contrary to people's Tesla myths and other stuff. So anyway, I can proceed. I'm hoping to publish it this year. I'm going to need money. I'm going to need people, you know, to really help me. I'd love to have people who want to do some research, but everybody that is talented and intelligent, like everybody on this thing, is already booked completely. So I have to go to a novice, I guess, to get help. You know, research help or something like that.
Am I allowed to give out your email address to people that I know as well?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so
do you know everybody that's on this call?
Everybody knows you, and I generally know everybody here, yeah, but I don't have necessarily everyone's emails. But what I will do is make your email available for anybody listening either here right now or on YouTube. Who wants to help out either financially or with their.
Well, everybody can get me at info@antonchaitkin.com.
That's what we'll do. I'm going to put that email, info@antonchaitkin.com, in the description box. So reach out to Anton if you want to help out with financial support or with some research support.
I started to get some harassment through that, but it's only a couple of instances. So.
Yeah, that's going to happen. I mean, there's going to be a lot of junk cluttering up your inbox, but that's par for the course of being public. But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, everyone.
See you later. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Take care. See ya.